For those of you that don't know me, I'm Robert Bean. I'm the curator of the program here at Arkansas Capitol. We've had the program for about a year. We've had 5 shows at this point, and we're looking forward to moving to 6 shows next year in 2015. It's been a pretty good success so far, and we're trying to do interesting programming like we're doing tonight. I'd like to thank Arkansas Capitol for being a good partner to the arts. It's always nice to see businesses and members of the community step up and join with the arts and culture community of Little Rock and make things happen. This is Timur Cleary and Christy Young. These are 2 of the artists in the current exhibition that we have here. Timur's a painter and Christy is a jeweler. So if you guys didn't have a chance to see the exhibition, after we're done, this will run probably about an hour. Feel free to wander around and see the work. It's really good stuff. I'd also like to thank Mugs Cafe for providing warm drinks tonight because it is really cold outside. I'm very proud of myself for actually timing that one right. And I had no idea it was going to be this cold and scheduled them a couple of months ago and it worked out perfect. As far as the discussion goes, I basically will throw questions at them and let them kind of answer. If you guys have questions, feel free to kind of raise your hand or let us know and join in the conversation. This is definitely not supposed to be any kind of like formal lecture. It's supposed to be more of a laid-back discussion. So with that in mind,
although when they do get a question, if they could repeat the question just for the mic are pointed at you guys, so
okay.
It'll pick you up better than it will anyone else.
Okay.
Yeah, and can I just say too, just like thanks for people to come and talk about art. We're framing around art and craft, and that's cool. But we just get to talk about art, and that's fun, and it's hard to find people who want to do that. So, thanks. And if I'm boring, then you can also just walk right out. I can't
Absolutely.
do that. I have to sit here.
If it turns out to be really awful, you guys are welcome to just kind of head on out the door.
And please, like Robert said, like join in. It really makes it more fun and more for you guys if you're part of it.
We talk about this stuff all the time.
Yeah.
It's fun to get everybody else involved that maybe doesn't talk about it all the time. If you can't tell, this is being filmed, but you guys will probably not ever be on camera because it's pointed at us, so don't worry about that. And with that, I'll go ahead and start throwing some questions at you guys and let you start. Actually, I kind of want to start with how you guys define fine art and how you define craft. I mean, that's kind of seems like a good basis to start with. So.
Well, I don't know the definition. That's why I want to have this conversation. And I actually don't think that we'll define it by the end of this conversation. And I can't wait to have it.
Okay.
I think there is a difference, though. Like, I don't think it's meaningful. I think there is a difference, and maybe we'll get closer to it.
Okay.
And how do I define craft and how do I define art? I definitely think it's an individual perspective. Craft to me is the actual hands-on process or technique, and I do believe it spills over into art once it is inspired by the individual, the artist. However that may be.
Okay.
I'm in for that.
Well, I think that's part of the reason we're having a discussion is that most people can't even define art. So trying to take something that's not easily definable and then try to differentiate it between that and craft is kind of an interesting exercise. There is a man named Paul Klein that's a longtime gallerist in Chicago, big arts advocate, has done a lot up there, and tends to be a real influence for critical thought in the arts. He once said that art happens when you see the soul of the artist. Craft, on the other hand, was defined as an artistic expression that is concerned with the use of materials. Do you guys agree with that?
I think that's pretty close to kind of what you started it off with, as working with materials, I think even was the word, in your hands, and the soul of the artist. I think you said the individual is what does it. I mean, that's kind of the same. I would see that as the same kind of a break. It's material to immaterial. right? The soul of the artist is the material, and the materials that we make it with is something else. And I think that that's a common line that is drawn between art and craft. But it's easier to say than it is to like point to something and say like, we're talking about a soul, so where is it? Maybe you feel it in the work of art.
I think crafting, even when it goes back historically, forever ago, can actually, I picture, you know, a group of so-called artisans, crafters, working on these projects, weaving baskets, maybe it's pottery, or they're actually working and doing these processes and these techniques, and they can get lost in just actually, you know, working with their hands and doing that to produce something maybe for someone else, but individually, when you're actually creating something, like myself, for instance, in jewelry, and you get lost in it, and you are doing what, here I go again, comes from you, then, you know, it does come from your soul and your imagination, and the process is something you're not aware of until you actually keep going through the process. And the end result is something you didn't sit down and design and say, this is exactly what I'm going to make. So I could go on and on about that, but
Yeah, and
I think you
that
get the picture.
That also
But
points to like people's, because it's materials, it can't be immaterial. And I like what you're saying, because it's like just your engagement with the material might be enough to make it art. And I think that it would be wrong to say that that's not possible.
yeah, for instance, like basket weaving, you know, you could sit there, or knitting, you can sit there and be doing that all day long and just keeping your hands busy. But when art, it's a totally different process. You can take a basket, it can still, you know, and it serves a function, but within it, maybe there's a specific design, you know, Indians designed the, or a rug, and to me, I look at that, and someone's heart and soul did go into that, and it is admired from within that individual artist, and also from, you know, whoever is viewing it as art.
Well, I think that brings up an interesting point, that when you look at especially something like older cultures, ones that maybe aren't around anymore, and Native American baskets is a good example of this. It was utilitarian, it had a lot of design to it, but for some of them, there aren't many left, and there's a rarity to them. And they tend to be treasured as art objects now, whereas I think if they were being made and mass-produced now, they'd just be considered craft. So how important do you think the original intent and the materials are to that definition? For example, a painting, most people will consider painting fine art because it has this kind of, it's not necessarily just decorative, they have this kind of other connotation to it. But a basket, most people see as utilitarian. So
That utilitarian makes it craft.
Right.
That's the
Right.
intention. Yeah, I mean, if that's it, then it was, and it became art through context of history, right? There's not so many left. That's one way to do it. It's a rarity. Maybe people feel certain things when they come in contact with those as an artifact too, which, I mean, we could do another night on art and artifact. We need lots of these opposing ideas to try and make a new idea, I think, in lots of things. And that basket example, it's just so context-based. It could change 10 years from now, you know, based on how we look at those things, the baskets, or some people might judge it by what they're worth. Those baskets are worth now in money, so that's a way of giving it credibility. I don't assign a lot of value to money, and as a judgment of art, it helps to pay my rent, but as a way to judge art, that's not one that I subscribe to very directly, but a lot of people do.
Do you think that the reverse can be true, that you could have something defined as fine art to begin with, but then maybe 20 years down the road, tastes have changed or definitions have changed, and now it gets defined simply as a craft item?
That's harder to imagine, I think, going in the other direction.
I agree.
Um,
Historically, though, I mean, all the the craftsmanship, but the heritage, the history that goes into and the passing down of the storytelling that went along with it. And that's another one, there were stories that were written in artwork. To me, that is definitely a collectible fine art,
So kind of
treasured.
once it's been put on that pedestal, it's hard to bring
Yeah.
it back down.
I believe that.
Okay. I agree with that. I think that's once it's been defined as something with that level of importance, with that level of value.
Is there an example of that ever happening? Like, could we?
I couldn't
could we
think of
name?
one. I couldn't think of one. That's why I asked
Does
the
anybody
question.
think of that? Yeah.
I was hoping you guys were smarter than me and could come up with something, but
If I went to the Met and took, some old goblet and started drinking out of it, would it be craft because I was using it and it was functional again?
Right. When you make it functional, does it
I
take
would be
away that-
arrested first, actually,
No.
Yeah.
before I got to drink out of it.
That kind of brings up one of the other questions I had. Let's talk a little bit about the longevity of an object, because I think it plays into a little bit of what we were just saying. If something has if you feel that the lifespan of a created object's concept, how long it remains relevant or interesting, plays into the definition. I mean, does that idea of it needs to be something long lasting? A lot of people look at fine art as this is something that will last several hundred years. It will be important. It is set apart from just something that I'm drinking out of. Do you think that has to be a component of defining something as fine art? Because we define concept art and performance art as art, but it's very temporary. It doesn't have longevity.
Good question.
Maybe its longevity is in the something that's written about it or the importance it's given. Whether the performance is taking place, it did take place. Documentation, I think, becomes a large aspect of that kind of work. But I think that the longevity only matters, I guess the context is changing, Older art means something different now than it did to, the Egyptians or Greeks. I mean, they still looked back to previous ages, but their art didn't change as much as ours does too. Nowadays, people are more concerned with originality and what's new, and that's why Damien Hirst sells for more than Rembrandt. That doesn't make any sense.
No, I would agree with that.
Yeah, but if again, I keep using money to judge it, and I keep saying I don't do that. Well, I don't believe in that. I don't think it's worth more. I think it just is worth more money.
And the market, that's what's changed. Is today we're, especially here in America, and we're driven by the market, and it puts such a value,
And people don't make anything anymore either.
That's true.
That's something that's more interesting about craft now is like 100 years ago, people made all kinds of stuff for themselves. If it's bread or, now if you can make bread, then it's like a really cool trick that you can do. But that's not a trick, that's just making food. I don't know, I guess it changes because people don't know how to, use a hammer. I teach students and they're like, turn the hammer around, and people don't make stuff as much anymore. And I think that's why there's kind of resurgence of craft movements too, is people miss that.
Do you think that's going to only strengthen a definition of what is craft and keep some things from being seen as art objects? Because there's a little bit of that push towards making things again, making your own items, or
I think it needs to have some originality to it to differentiate it from just something that's handmade. You know, wood, the baskets, carvings, and then it goes back to functionality and what makes it unique and different. Push it more in that artistic direction.
okay. Well, thinking in those terms, for example, there are several spots in Arkansas where you can drive along and it's like pottery studio, and they're mass produced, but they may have their own designs, but they may produce 30 of that design. Do you see that as craft or as art?
I see it a little bit more as craft when
Okay.
it's mass produced.
So mass production has something to do with it, even if it's mass production on a small scale.
And we do have, I mean, that's definitely today has changed a lot. And that's why I think people crave something that's one of a kind or unique and they want a piece of art versus, getting something that everybody else has. It's exactly the same.
I think mass produced is kind of a tricky term too, because I don't know what that actually means. Like, is 5 people working in a ceramics studio making lots of
That's true.
ceramics, is that mass production? Or when it leaves their hands and machines do it, when is it being mass produced? Because
Well, I was thinking in terms of they're all working off the same blueprint, the same design.
That's
Every cup is being made with this in mind, with this sort of handle. They may paint it a little different, but it's the same form.
It's craft. There's a bunch of craft going into that. That's what I mean. The mind's not. It's just doing what it's told to do. There's no.
They're producing an object.
Yeah, it sounds pretty
creative
dry.
spirit
I mean,
going in.
that description
Okay.
sounds pretty dry.
Yeah.
But also, like, what we were saying before, like, just your engagement with materials of
Right.
people in workshops making baskets or something. Or there's also the complication of lots of artists in the past and contemporarily who work with lots of people under them, helping them make work.
Mhm.
Lots of well-known artists who couldn't make their work without help from other people,
Right.
dead and alive. And I don't know if that's mass production, because they couldn't do it otherwise. Richard Serra has a foundry in Germany that pours 6-inch cordon steel walls that are taller than this room, so he can bring them around. And those aren't mass produced, I guess, because there's only so many of them. But my God, that sure is out of his hands. And he needs help
It's
to
an
make it.
original idea, which brings a group together to help, form it.
I would think that the idea is taking precedence
Yeah.
in that example.
That's not what I picture as mass produced.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's way off. You're right.
Yeah.
I would see that more as using a team to produce one item, essentially, one concept.
So what if the guy in that ceramics studio is really in love with ceramics and he just loves them and he spends a lot of time and a lot of care and puts his heart and ideas into these cups that he designs, and then the same people make those cups? That's when it becomes art.
That's kind of the question,
The same
isn't it?
people,
Yeah, same people doing it, except the guy in charge is like just
his idea.
in love and
Yeah.
impassioned and inspired guy.
But
does-
somebody else is doing it for him.
Yeah.
Well, I see it a little bit of an analogy there of, in the same way that you may have an artist or a ceramicist produce that original design and then have a team of artisans copy and make 40 of them off that design, in the same way that a painter might produce a single painting and then produce a Giclée print reproduction run of 100 and sell those. And while the Giclées wouldn't be considered art, the original paintings still would. Do you think that you can have that division when you look at other materials like glass or clay, where maybe the artist creates the original by itself, and then to make money and pay the mortgage, as a team produce copies of that, would you still consider the first one art, or would you consider it all craft?
You know, Thomas Kincaid has painting making machines. I think a common way that people would do it is point to the machine. Like, the painting into the print is a machine that does it. The ceramics into, like, the people who work for him. Whoever this fictional ceramics guy is that we're talking about, his character is growing. I kind of like him.
Too,
yeah,
right?
yeah. But, you know, since people make it with their hands, like, for some reason I feel more inclined to be like, well, the art can stay then if the hand is on it. I don't know if that's true, but for some reason there seems to be some kind of a line between machine and hand. Could probably find counterexamples to that too, I guess.
Well, I think the idea of it being made by hand is very important to people.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of promotion of the idea of handmade crafts, and then.
Can you have not handmade crafts?
That's kind of what I'm getting at. But at the same time, we don't consider. Most people don't try to promote a painting as handmade.
Right.
It's a painting. It's art. But handmade pottery, handmade's a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Is it because the painting can't be easily mass produced in its original materials in the same way that a clay cup could be mass produced in the same materials? I really didn't plan to think this hard.
I think it's functionality there too. Is like, what's the function of a painting? It's disinterested in function. You have to engage it on this like romantic aesthetic level of like, it doesn't do anything. It just is there. And cups do that, and they also are useful. Paintings are pretty useless.
I disagree.
On a very, straightforward
Well,
level.
on a utilitarian level, I think
What
paintings.
about a mask and a mask and you hang it on the wall? It's a mask, but it's a piece of art.
Or is it still a mask if no one's wearing it? I like your disagreement.
Exactly.
Why do you disagree?
Yeah.
Because I think that you say that it's like not functional, but I think that the way it affects people is very functional.
The emotional
The emotional,
aspect.
yeah,
Sure.
the
Yeah.
emotional
Of
effect.
art.
Like I have people that I've sold paintings to come to me and say, your painting has brought me joy every single day that I look at it. That's a function.
Yeah, I think that's a function. It's not a utilitarian function in the same way as a cup. It's really useful and good. Some aesthetics arguments would say it's not. It's, I don't know. Plato would say it's not. It's not the real thing. I don't necessarily want to go down that road, but I think there's a difference between the emotional thing. I think that's maybe some of what we're talking about in art too, is like the feeling that it gives you. Knowing it's an original gives you a feeling. There's a good piece in the New York Times about people who forge paintings and people who live with forged paintings and they don't know it. And then they find out, and the meaning of the painting changes because it doesn't have that original person to it. So it's still part of the context that we bring to it in that case. And that's something that makes it a little different for me. And it's like the original, the hand of the artist. Even though paintings aren't said that they're handmade, you don't need to. A painting is one. There's only one of it. And it's a unique art object. Just like, each one of your pieces here is the same way, is totally unique from your hand and from the forces that make it and you picking it out and all the other things that go into choosing and, bring it down to this singularity. And when you get to that, I think you could be pretty comfortable that you're making artwork because that's the only one.
And for instance, if you're painting a certain landscape that, hundreds of artists have painted, you painting it's going to have your, individuality and your touch on it. Like, I know who did that,
Sure.
It's, it makes it, totally unique to you.
Well, I have paintings in the show that weren't totally made by me. Also, a number of them are made in a class I teach at UALR where my students help me make paintings from very early on, and you know, preparing the surface and stuff to even starting the paintings for me.
Right.
So, and I was really uncomfortable with that, and in some ways maybe I still am, but I really like that it's not just my touch. Maybe I could say it's my touch to choose to include them also. So even touch, I think, is a slippery slope.
Right.
Or mass production, silkscreen, all Warhols are different, but they're kind of all the same too.
Right.
How much does context matter? I can't help but think of Marcel Duchamp's urinal.
Sure.
You
Right.
know, I mean, you put a urinal on a pedestal in a museum, it's art. So in the bathroom, it's just a urinal.
Yeah, I think context matters 100%. I think that's all there is, and that's maybe all we're trying to get tonight is some kind of context around how to define art. And I don't think we will, but I really like talking about this with you guys and everybody else.
Well, that brings me to another question, in that if context and if concept is so important to defining something as fine art, and you can get to the point where the concept can be generated by one person and then you have others execute it, do you feel that this is giving almost a lazy out to some contemporary artists and the technique is slipping because of it? Like Damien Hirst.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of disagree. I think conceptualism is the lazy way out. The urinal's the greatest example of that. He didn't
Well, that's
do
what I'm
anything.
getting. That's what I'm getting at. Do you think it's making some artists lazy that they can just rely on the concept and not have to make the object themselves?
Okay, yeah, sorry, I'm hearing it backwards for some reason. Yeah, I totally agree. But I think I see craft people do that too when they say like, oh, I just do craft, I don't have any. They shut down the idea that they may have a concept in their work as a kind of lazy out as well, because I think sometimes they do that too quick, and I think their work is cooler than they give it credit for.
That was going to be my next question. Do you think it works the other way with craft? Where craftspeople may be creating a series of objects that honestly they could elevate to that next level and call it fine art, but just they're so involved in the technique of what they're making that they miss, they miss the forest for the trees,
I think they could get lost in that.
Yeah.
But it's a shame, because you could totally put your own spin on it.
And if you really get lost in it, then why isn't that a concept? Why it's weird.
Just the not even thinking about it, process of doing something.
That's a beautiful concept to me.
Okay.
I love just involve yourself with the materials, and when
there's nothing wrong with
and
that.
people say
sure.
like, what's it really about? What else is it about other than what it is? And there's a lot of art that's just made for modernism is essentially art about what it is and how it's made. And it's weird that sometimes, that concept. The concept is maybe the immaterial, right? At the beginning you said the soul, the immaterial thing.
Process.
The concept is that immaterial addition that we want from work, for it to be more than the thing that it is, more than the sum of its parts. And I think if we can say that it gets to that level for us, then we would be comfortable saying, hey, that's art, because it's more than the sum of its parts. And I think that craft people make lots of stuff that's, more than the sum of its parts. And why? I don't know, why is craft seen as like...
It's like a second class citizen.
Yeah, I
in the
don't
arts.
get that,
Right.
yeah. And how is it even really different in some ways? I'm not so sure.
I think it's very much the same, and I think there's a bias
I
towards
do
craft
too.
or against craft that some fine art can get away with, even though the craft is much more technically accomplished than the guy that says he's a painter and isn't really good.
It's academic is the root of that bias is academic, because so much art is academic now, because so many people have art degrees and MFAs, and they go to school and they learn the same way to talk about it and interpret concept into work, that it becomes such an overdriving force, and all artist statements start to sound the same then. And I just want to hang out with craft people then. Get rid of all those other people and just have fun and make work.
And you take it back. I was thinking about this, talking about craft and art. You think about how they always don't lose your the spirit you have when you were a child. You put a child in a room
Yeah.
and you put all the colors or whatever down, he hasn't learned any skills, or he's developing his own creativity right there if you just leave him alone. And then you go back to education.
Especially if you leave them alone.
Yeah, and if you go to, you get all this knowledge going in your head and all these, gotta do it this way and that way, and if you're not careful, you can lose that, just that simple childhood, like, imagination and creativity,
Well,
potential that,
I think you're onto something there too. When you look at when you give a child a box of crayons and watch them draw, they're actually usually drawing correctly. It's taught out of them in school when they learn how to write. When you see, and I'm sure you've seen some of this when you teach, especially basic level drawing classes, and you get students that come in and they start drawing and they're drawing like they're writing, and you have to tell them, stop doing that. You have to use your entire arm like a kid does. So it's fun to watch like a 3-year-old with crayons, because you're like, you're doing it right. And someone's going to teach that out of you, and then when you go to college and go into art school, they're going to have to teach you to stop doing what, and you go back through all of it. So,
Or even that, like, my son eats crayons, like, that you have to teach them what a crayon is for. Like, it's almost hard to tell him, like, don't eat that. It's not good for him, but it's cool that you can see things in such a wide open way. And I think a lot of academic art instruction has become very narrow and very focused on making a certain type of art that looks different on the surface, but is in a lot of ways very derivative.
In what way, like, what kind of like academia are you like basing that on? Because like I went to school in St. Louis and it was definitely not like that.
I guess I'm basing it on my limited experience. I teach at UALR, and I say bad things about academia, but I really believe in academia also. I just think that
Like
some
I
things
definitely
need
like
to be
agree
fixed.
with you. Like I think that it's been really, really like kind of like a lot of it's been mulled over, and like that's one of the reasons I didn't go to school anywhere here, because like I kind of learned a lot of that that was bad about that. But like I think that there's some good things that come from like different places. So.
I agree too, and I think mine is kind of based on, I taught internationally also in my wife is over there. She's really pretty in the red scarf. I lived with her in Pakistan and I taught there. And I taught at Columbus College of Art and Design. I went to school in Brooklyn at Pratt, and I live in Arkansas and teach and see work now. So some of it's based off of just like, I can't believe how much the same it is that's a limited selection, but it has some range to it at least. And I can't believe how single-minded it's become in some ways. I really liked Pakistan because they had a lot of leftover craft that wasn't self-conscious and was just like, almost to the point of like having a ruler out and hitting people's hands,
So if you're bringing that back to here, then like kudos to you. 'Cause that's awesome.
But I don't know what I'm bringing back because I guess I'm hoping to bring some of that back. I don't know. I just.
well, and just learning new techniques. You may have these ideas that you want to take and apply it with your new techniques. So education is good. I mean, I want to keep growing and learning new avenues and ways to do my jewelry work. So
Oh yeah, that's I think you've got to keep.
Yeah, you take it to another level, and the ideas can come with it. Just don't be so narrow.
Sorry, don't mean to
No.
interrupt.
No,
It's good. It's very
Good.
yeah, grab a
Good
chair.
topic.
Yeah.
So-
Everybody.
we've thrown around the term of fine art a few times. I know recently in the last few decades, there's been a little bit of a movement to define it as fine craft. To say that there is a level of craft that's the same as fine art, but for some reason is different. Do you see that as something that should even happen? Or should we just go ahead and say if it got to that level, it's art already,
Yeah,
and don't worry about trying to come up with another term?
And I think it's also how you value yourself as an artist, and where you want to take it. And, Yeah, I think, art's craft and craft is art, and painting, it starts out as craft. You learn to use your brush and your paints and techniques, and then it blossoms from there, just as, so-called craft would be. Pottery and sculpting, and lose yourself in it, become art.
Fine craft.
Fine craft.
Fine
I don't like the way that rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, I think just take like the full step.
Yeah.
Why is it even a step? Why does it seem so ingrained that that's a step up? Would anyone consider it a step down to go from craft to fine art? That's the half step in between or something this term.
It's kind of
why
weird,
is
yeah.
that? Why is that so ingrained? And I don't know why that is. It really feels that way sometimes, though.
Mm-hmm.
Because art doesn't matter how it's. Craft has to be well made, and art used to have to be well made, but now you can make it appropriate or right. But it could be made purposely stupid or bad, or that's a whole genres of art. And craft doesn't get to do that because art has the soul and the concept behind it, so it can put a urinal up on a thing and still be art. Yeah.
So craft can't be stupid.
Yeah, isn't that great?
So we kind of established that you can have craft without art. Can you have art without some sort of craft? Because if we go by that definition that you threw out at the beginning, where art is when you see the soul of the artist. You can see the soul of the artist in a lot of garbage across every artistic medium.
I would agree with that.
So are those art?
Yeah, or the soul of people in non-art. I mean,
Performing art.
I see the soul of people in the way they like crash their car a few times, or it's kind of subjective, I guess, where you see that. But your question is, can there be art without any craft?
Right. Well, this is just basically how fully do you guys subscribe to that definition that Robert read out earlier on? Because if art is just seeing the soul of the artist, then there's, like I said, you see the soul of the artist in a lot of really bad works of anything. So should those things be considered art? And if we consider them art by that definition, does that make that definition perhaps a little flawed, or I don't know?
It may be art, but as a viewer, the value you place on it, could be down here. If it's in bad taste or.
It's troublesome because it's so subjective, like when the soul appears in a work of art or not a work of art, and I don't want to only use soul. I just want to use like something more than the sum of its parts. Too, it could be soul, it could be concept, it could be money that people pay for the work. It's all these different currencies that we use, and one currency is easy to see is money, and one that's harder to see is the currency of more than the sum of its parts, which you could use soul, you could use concept, you could use, hey, so-and-so wrote a piece about me. That's another way to elevate the work. And so I think that that's tricky because it's subjective, but I like it because I feel like I see the soul of Thomas Kincaid in his work, and I don't like the soul that I see, and apparently he didn't either. So maybe that's real. It seemed to be there, but I'm not so sure I'd call that art. I'd call it fascinating and horrifying. But so art could be that too. So I'm still stuck with it. Yeah.
So wouldn't it then be just kind of up to the person who's viewing it? I mean,
Totally.
They deem it either way. It depends on how it manifests their emotions and everything to it.
So then you have a question though of if one person sees it as aesthetically pleasing and it does something for them, and another person goes, "That's just a basket." How do you define it between the two?
And that you can't have value if everything's relative too. If it's all up to everybody's subjective interpretation, then how do we know what's better? You can only look to yourself to know what it's worth. And that's scary for me. So, because then some people are right that I really think aren't right, or I don't know, relativity is scary, and it's a bigger problem now in postmodernism because art doesn't have like a protection of this school or something. I mean, it's all kinds of stuff.
To me, that brings up when you start talking about like the postmodern era. Do you think that traditional fine art media, when you look at like sculpture or painting, drawing, do you think that a lot of times works created in those media get a free pass as being labeled as fine art when maybe they shouldn't be, just because they were made with charcoal or just because they were made with oil paints? They're labeled as fine art by default instead of necessarily.
Maybe to extend that, like, do you feel like you have to, or you want to tell people that your work is art? Do you feel like people are like, oh, that's craft, that's not art? Are they devaluing it when they do that?
Personally, it comes across that way to me, because each piece is original and different, and I'm picturing, myself and what I put into it. So yeah, it is kind of a harsh way of looking at my work, and yeah.
I think that's that's interesting too, I guess, because I get the free pass since I'm a painter, so maybe I don't even know, and I just am riding painting's coattails.
Well, I work in those same painting, drawing media,
Yeah.
so a lot of times people look at my work and they're like, that's art. I'm like,
Well, you do. Sometimes you feel inferior when you're, when you're viewed that way. So,
Maybe I just wish that like craft people would be like, yeah, it's absolutely craft.
Yeah.
What's wrong with that? Is that worse than art? I didn't know about that. It's I can't empathize with that kind of stereotype because I guess I don't get it because I do the time-honored medium.
Maybe the disparity between fine art and craft comes from the like class origins of its creation. Like fine art would have come from an academic circle where you would have to be moneyed to become educated in the first place, whereas like craft is necessarily kind of utilitarian, so it would come from people who needed to solve those problems and couldn't afford to purchase things from people who made them for a living necessarily. So
Totally.
that's a very good point. You should have been up here. I think you just answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I mean, in its currency too, like the knowledge or the money, the pharaohs built the pyramids, but they didn't build them. They just had slaves or people to build them, but their name goes to it because they're behind it in that way. And you don't acknowledge the artist. When artists start signing their work, that's a big break in art history of like, there's the soul. Like that's the first soul, or I guess if we're gonna call it a soul or the other thing, like who Da Vinci made it. Whoa, shit, that's something else. That signature is weird, and that to me is tied to the Sistine Chapel because everyone's like, that was owned, like Michelangelo kicked everybody out, and he only let like his pure self come in there, which one acknowledges that it wasn't only him that was making other things too. I don't know if that's true. And three, it makes art like a myth, like you can't touch him or other people couldn't be there helping him. And that's scary to me too when art gets mythicized because it's like unreachable, kind of.
Do you feel that there should be maybe a stronger scrutiny of work that's being created today? I mean, we're talking about some of the points were made of whether or not it's really if the soul is there or not, and whether or not it's craft. Do you think we need to have a stronger sense of scrutiny of what's being made, or should it just be up to each person?
I think it's left to the viewer, and ultimately that will be decided. It's each individual's perspective of that particular piece of art, you know.
Yeah,
There might be a grand audience, you know, and it gives it, you know, more value.
Until we get a soul detector or like a, you know, content machine reader, like it's gonna be pretty subjective. You know, there's widening circles too, though. Like, of what if 10 people think it's good and 3 people don't think it is? Like, is that credibility? Hey, you! Ladon, you want to take some questions with me? Hi, Jay.
So we've got time for one more question, and I'm going to put it out there. Since we discussed all of this, do you think it's even worthwhile to define fine art or craft, or it's something that people, they use these terms all the time, and a lot of people don't necessarily know what one is and one isn't. Do you think it's even worthwhile trying to do that, or should we just kind of make them all art?
I think it can be synonymous. I think, you know, it's that soul thing again. It's been, I think, I mean, it's evolved through time. You know, it's all changed, and I feel like there's so much artistic and creativity that's going into the craft world these days, and definitely think there's not much of a difference. There can be in some crafts, you know, but it's what that individual puts into it, their heart and soul, and it makes it art. It's theirs, their art.
I think no and yes. No, because I'm not so sure I can find a difference between the two as we like really get into it. If I really like craft or emotionally respond to it, is it then art? I don't know. It's hard for me to almost imagine raw, just like craft at this point, other than like a machine making it. But I think yes, because with the distinction, we get to talk about stuff like this, and that's really fun. And maybe we'll get rid of it, and if we do, we'll replace it with another discussion, and that's just what art is for. And that's why I like getting to talk about it, because here we are. This is cool.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and our two artists for taking the time to
Thanks for
try to answer some questions.